When Catherine stepped off the train in 1885 with only 17 cents and a crumpled divorce letter, she thought her life was over, until a mysterious rancher with storm-gray eyes offered her something no man ever had: a chance to discover who she really was. But when her vengeful husband arrives to drag her back to Boston, she'll have to choose between the safety of society's chains and the terrifying freedom of writing her own destiny. Will she find the courage to fight for the life she's built, or will she lose everything she's discovered about her own worth? The train wheels screamed against the metal tracks as Catherine pressed her face to the cold window, watching her old life disappear into the gray October morning. Her fingers clutched the letter that had changed everything, the paper soft from being read 100 times. The words still burned in her mind like hot coals. Our marriage was a mistake. Do not try to find me. You are no longer welcome in Boston. 17 cents. That's all she had left after buying the train ticket to nowhere. The other passengers stared at her red eyes and wrinkled dress, whispering behind their hands. A woman traveling alone meant only one thing to them: trouble. Next stop, Millbrook, the conductor called out, his voice cutting through her thoughts like a knife. End of the line. Catherine's stomach twisted. End of the line. How perfect. The train station looked like something from a nightmare. Wooden boards creaked under her feet as she stepped onto the platform, her small bag heavy in her trembling hands. The wind cut through her thin coat, making her teeth chatter. Around her, the few other passengers hurried away to waiting carriages and warm homes. She stood alone as the train pulled away, its whistle fading into the distance like a dying scream. Millbrook wasn't much of a town. A few buildings lined a dusty main street that looked like it might blow away in the next strong wind. The mountains rose up around the valley like giant stone walls, making her feel trapped and tiny. Back in Boston, she had lived in a house with 12 rooms and servants who brought her tea on silver trays. Now she owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a wedding ring that felt like a chain around her finger. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. A baby cried. Normal sounds of normal people living normal lives. Catherine had no idea what normal meant anymore. Her feet moved without her telling them to, carrying her down the main street past buildings that looked half-finished. The general store had a crooked sign that read Murphy's Goods. A saloon called the Dusty Boot leaked the sounds of men laughing and piano music into the cold air. Everything smelled like dust and horses and something she couldn't name, maybe hope, maybe despair. Her stomach growled loud enough to make her blush. When had she last eaten? Yesterday? The day before? Time had become strange since Charles threw her out. Hours felt like years, and days passed like minutes. The general store door had a little bell that rang when she pushed it open. The sound made her jump. Inside, shelves lined the walls, filled with things normal people needed: flour, coffee, rope, boots. Things for people who had homes and lives and futures. Behind the counter stood a thin man with mean eyes and a mouth that looked like it had never smiled. He watched her walk in like she might steal something, his gaze taking in her rumpled dress and desperate face. "Help you?" he asked, but his tone said he didn't want to help anybody. Catherine's cheeks burned. "I'm looking for work. Any kind of work." The man laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Work? Lady, do you see where you are? This ain't some fancy city where ladies play at having jobs. Women here either got husbands or they got nothing. Which one are you?" Before Catherine could answer, the doorbell rang again. Heavy footsteps crossed the wooden floor behind her. She could feel someone watching her, but she didn't turn around. Her face was already red enough. "Murphy, you got any of that good coffee left?" a deep voice asked. The voice sounded kind, tired, but kind. "Sure do, Tom. But I got me a situation here first." Murphy nodded toward Catherine like she was a problem that needed solving. "This lady wants work." Catherine finally turned around. The man standing behind her was tall, with dark hair that had silver streaks at the sides. His clothes were clean but old, mended in places with careful stitches. His hands were rough and scarred from hard work. But his eyes were gentle, like storm clouds that might bring rain to thirsty ground. "What kind of work?" he asked, looking at Catherine instead of Murphy. "Anything," Catherine said, hating how small her voice sounded. "I can cook, clean, so I learn quickly." Murphy snorted. "She's got city written all over her, Tom. Probably never worked a day in her life." The man Tom ignored Murphy completely. He studied Catherine's face like he was reading a book, seeing things others missed. "I'm Thomas Garrett. I run a ranch about 15 miles north of here. Just lost my housekeeper last month. Job comes with a room and 3 meals a day. Wages are fair." Catherine's heart jumped like a bird trying to escape a cage. "I'm Catherine, and yes, I'll take it." "Hold on there," Murphy said, his voice sharp. "Tom, you sure about this? That woman's running from something, mark my words. Probably husband trouble." Thomas's jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Every person in this territory is running from something, Murphy. Question is whether they're running toward something better or just running scared." He looked at Catherine again. "Which one are you?" Catherine thought about Charles, about the house in Boston that had felt like a beautiful prison, about the friends who had dropped her the moment scandal touched her name. She thought about the wedding ring cutting into her finger and the way her husband had looked at her like she was broken furniture he wanted to throw away. "I'm running toward something better," she said, and for the first time in weeks, she meant it. Thomas nodded slowly. "Good. We'll leave in an hour. That enough time to get your things?" Catherine held up her small bag. "This is everything I have." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Understanding, maybe, or pity. She hoped it wasn't pity. "Murphy, give me a pound of that good coffee and some of those crackers," Thomas said, reaching into his pocket for coins. "And maybe some cheese if it's not too old." "Coming right up," Murphy said, suddenly much friendlier now that money was involved. As Murphy gathered the supplies, Thomas turned back to Catherine. "Ranch work isn't easy, especially for someone who's not used to it. You sure you want this?" Catherine thought about sleeping under bridges, about begging for scraps, about going back to Boston and admitting defeat. She thought about Charles laughing when he heard she had failed. "I'm stronger than I look," she said. Thomas smiled for the first time since she'd met him. It changed his whole face, making him look younger and less sad. "We'll see about that. My wagon's outside. Wait for me there." Catherine walked outside into the cold wind, her heart beating fast for the first time in weeks. Behind her, she could hear Thomas talking to Murphy in low voices. She caught words like, "decent woman," and "none of your business," and "mind your own troubles." The wagon was old but well-kept, pulled by 2 horses that looked strong and healthy. Catherine climbed onto the wooden seat, her hands shaking from cold and nerves and something that might have been excitement. When Thomas came out of the store, his arms full of supplies, he looked at her sitting in his wagon and nodded like she belonged there. "One thing," he said as he loaded the supplies into the back. "Ranch has rules. No drinking, no men visitors, no stealing, no lying. You break the rules, you're gone." "We clear." "Crystal clear," Catherine said. Thomas climbed up beside her and picked up the reins. The horses snorted and stamped, ready to go home. As they pulled away from the general store, Catherine saw Murphy watching through the window, his face twisted with disappointment at losing his entertainment. "Don't mind Murphy," Thomas said as they rolled down the main street. "He's bitter because his own wife left him last spring. Ran off with a traveling salesman. Now he thinks all women are trouble." Catherine watched the buildings of Millbrook fade behind them as they headed north toward the mountains. Are you what? Trouble?" Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his eyes on the road ahead. "I think," he said finally, "that trouble and opportunity often wear the same face. Guess we'll find out which one you are." "Tell me about the woman who lived there before me," Catherine said as the wagon wheels found every hole in the rough dirt road. Thomas's hands tightened on the leather reins. His jaw went hard like stone. For a minute, Catherine thought he wouldn't answer at all. "Her name was Maria Santos," he said finally. Came up from Mexico with her brother 5 years ago. Best cook in 3 counties and could fix anything that broke. Saved my ranch more times than I can count. What happened to her? Got married. Moved to California with her new husband. Thomas glanced at Catherine sideways. Left me with a house that's falling apart and food that tastes like old boots. Catherine smiled at that. I can't promise my cooking will save your ranch, but it won't kill you either. That's more than I can say for my own attempts, Thomas said. The road climbed steadily upward, winding between tall pine trees and rocky outcrops. Catherine had never seen country like this, wild and huge and empty of people. In Boston, you could never get away from the sound of carriages and shouting and church bells. Here, the only sounds were wind in the trees and the steady clip-clop of horse hooves. You afraid of hard work? Thomas asked suddenly. I don't know, Catherine said honestly. I've never done any. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop. Never done any hard work? Not ever. Catherine's cheeks burned red. My husband didn't believe wives should work. I spent my days reading, doing needlework, planning dinner parties. Useless things. Reading isn't useless, Thomas said. Can you do numbers? Keep books. Yes, I managed all our household accounts. Good. Maria was hopeless with numbers. Nearly got me in trouble with the bank twice. Thomas clicked his tongue and the horses started moving again. What about your family? Won't they worry when you don't come home? Catherine stared at her hands folded in her lap. My parents died when I was 16. Charles was all the family I had. She looked up at the mountains, their peaks covered with snow even though it was only October. He made sure I knew that. Made sure I understood how grateful I should be. Grateful for what? For being chosen. For having a place. For not being alone. The words tasted bitter in her mouth. Funny how quickly gratitude turns into a cage. Thomas was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer. My Sarah used to say that about her first marriage. Said her first husband made her feel like a pet he kept around for decoration. Sarah? Thomas's face changed, becoming gentler and sadder at the same time. My wife. She died in the spring. Catherine felt her stomach drop. I'm sorry. I didn't know. No reason you should. Thomas pointed ahead where a valley opened up between the mountains. There's the ranch. Catherine gasped. The valley spread out below them like a green carpet, crossed by a silver stream that caught the afternoon sunlight. Cattle dotted the grassland like brown and black spots. And in the center of it all stood a white house with a red roof, surrounded by barns and corrals, and a garden gone wild with late-season flowers. It's beautiful, Catherine breathed. Sarah thought so too. Said it looked like a place where good things could grow. Thomas's voice caught a little. She was right about most things. They drove down into the valley as the sun started to sink toward the western mountains. The air smelled different here, clean and sharp, like pine needles and snow. Catherine could hear the stream babbling over rocks and see deer grazing at the edge of the forest. As they got closer to the house, Catherine could see it needed work. The porch sagged on one side, paint peeled from the shutters. The garden was a tangle of weeds and overgrown roses. But the bones were good solid walls, a straight roof, windows that would let in morning light. House hasn't had a woman's touch in months, Thomas said, sounding embarrassed. I'm better with cattle than I am with cleaning. The wagon pulled up to the front porch just as a big yellow dog came bounding around the corner of the house, barking and wagging his tail at the same time. That's Rusty, Thomas said, climbing down from the wagon. He's friendly but not too bright. Don't let him in the house or he'll eat everything including the furniture. Catherine climbed down carefully, her legs stiff from the long ride. Rusty sniffed her hands and decided she was acceptable, giving her wet dog kisses that made her laugh. When did you last laugh? Thomas asked, watching her pet the dog. Catherine stopped mid-laugh, surprised by the question. I don't remember. That's a shame. You have a nice laugh. Heat climbed up Catherine's neck. She wasn't used to compliments that felt real instead of polite. Thomas grabbed her bag from the wagon and headed for the porch. "Come on. I'll show you around before it gets dark." The inside of the house was even more neglected than the outside. Dust covered every surface. Dishes sat piled in the kitchen sink. Clothes lay scattered across chairs. It looked like a place where someone had given up trying. "This was Sarah's domain," Thomas said, looking around the messy kitchen with sad eyes. "I haven't known what to do with it since she died." Catherine walked to the window over the kitchen sink and looked out at the garden. Even overgrown and wild, she could see the planning that had gone into it: vegetables near the house for easy picking, herbs by the kitchen door, flowers arranged by color and height. She was a gardener, Catherine said. Best in the territory. Could grow anything, anywhere. Said the secret was paying attention to what each plant needed instead of trying to make them all the same. Catherine touched a dusty jar on the windowsill. It was filled with seeds, beans, maybe, or squash. "May I? May you what?" "Work in the garden. When I have time." Thomas looked surprised. "You know about gardening?" "No, but I'd like to learn." Catherine picked up the seed jar and held it up to the light. Sarah was right. Different things need different care. Maybe that's true for people too. Something shifted in Thomas's expression. "Maybe it is." He showed her through the rest of the house, the front room with its big stone fireplace, the bedroom that would be hers, the little office where he kept his ranch records in complete chaos. Everything was covered in dust and neglect, but Catherine could see the love that had once lived here. "Sarah decorated it all," Thomas said as they climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor. "I wanted to buy everything new, but she said a house should grow around the people who live in it, not be imposed on them." Catherine's room was small but bright, with windows facing east toward the mountains. A simple bed, a chest of drawers, a chair by the window. Clean and spare, but somehow welcoming. "There are quilts in the chest," Thomas said. "Nights get cold up here, even in fall." "Thank you." Catherine set her bag on the bed and looked around her new home. Home. When had she last had a place that felt like home instead of a stage where she performed being a wife? "I'll let you get settled," Thomas said. "Supper's in an hour. Nothing fancy. Just beans and bread." After he left, Catherine sat on the bed and tried to understand what had happened to her life. This morning she had been a homeless woman with 17 cents and no future. Now she had a job, a room, and something that felt almost like hope. She opened the chest and found quilts that smelled like lavender and sunshine. As she shook one out to put on the bed, a piece of paper fell to the floor. Catherine picked it up and saw it was a note written in elegant handwriting. "Welcome, whoever you are. This room has been waiting for someone who needs it. Be kind to Thomas, he's hurting more than he shows. The garden knows all the secrets if you listen. Sarah." Catherine read the note 3 times before she understood. Sarah had left it for whoever came after her. Like she had known someone would need this place, this room, this chance to start over. Outside her window, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky the color of roses. In the distance, she could hear Thomas calling the cattle home for the night, his voice carrying across the valley like a song. For the first time since Charles had thrown her away, Catherine felt like she might belong somewhere. But belonging, she was learning, was more complicated than just having a place to sleep. Thomas's ranch stretched out before Catherine like a puzzle she'd never learned to solve. The wooden fence posts marched across rolling hills dotted with cattle that looked tiny as toys from the wagon seat. But as they drew closer to the animals, Catherine realized each beast stood taller than her and weighed more than 3 grown men combined. "Those are some of the biggest creatures I've ever seen," she whispered, gripping the wagon's edge as a massive bull lifted his head to stare at them with dark, unreadable eyes. Thomas chuckled, the first genuine smile she'd seen from him. "City folk always say that, but cattle are gentle as kittens if you treat them right. It's the horses you have to watch out for." As if summoned by his words, a magnificent black stallion appeared at the pasture fence, tossing his head and pawing the ground. Steam rose from his nostrils in the cool air, making him look like something from a fairy tale about dragons and knights. "That's Thunder," Thomas said with obvious pride. "Smartest horse I've ever known. But he's got opinions about everything." Sarah used to say he was more like a grumpy old man than a horse. The mention of his dead wife hung in the air between them like morning fog. Catherine wanted to ask more about Sarah, but something in Thomas's expression warned her to wait. Some stories she was learning had to be earned. The house appeared around a bend in the dirt road, and Catherine's heart sank. The building leaned slightly to one side, as if it had grown tired of standing straight. Paint peeled from the shutters like old skin, and the front porch sagged under the weight of broken furniture and rusted tools. "I know it doesn't look like much," Thomas said quickly, noticing her expression. "Haven't had time to keep up with repairs since Sarah passed. But it's solid. Roof doesn't leak, and the stove works fine." Catherine climbed down from the wagon, her legs shaking from the long ride. The silence here was different from city quiet. In Boston, silence meant something was wrong. Here, it felt natural, like the land itself was holding its breath. A chicken wandered across the yard, pecking at invisible treasures in the dirt. Behind the house, Catherine could see a vegetable garden gone wild, with pumpkins sprawled across what had once been neat rows. A barn stood in the distance, its red paint faded but its structure strong. "The chickens provide eggs," Thomas explained, following her gaze. "The garden gives us vegetables through the summer. We butcher a steer in the fall for winter meat. Most everything we need we can grow or make ourselves." Catherine nodded, though the idea of butchering anything larger than a fish made her stomach turn. In Boston, meat appeared on her table already cut into neat portions, wrapped in clean paper. She'd never considered where it came from or who had done the bloody work of preparing it. "Where do I sleep?" she asked, suddenly aware that she was about to live alone with a man she barely knew. Thomas's face reddened. "There's a small room off the kitchen. Built it for hired hands, but it's got a good bed and a window. Door has a lock," he added quickly. "I want you to feel safe here." The room was smaller than her closet in Boston, but it was clean and dry. A narrow bed sat against one wall, covered with a quilt that showed the careful stitching of loving hands. A washstand held a blue ceramic pitcher and bowl, and hooks on the wall offered space for her few belongings. "Sarah made that quilt," Thomas said from the doorway. "Took her 2 winters to finish it. She said the pattern was called Wedding Ring, but I always thought it looked more like flowers dancing in the wind." Catherine ran her fingers over the intricate stitching, imagining the woman who had sat by lamplight, creating beauty with needle and thread. "It's lovely. Are you sure you want me to use it?" She made it to be used, not admired. Sarah always said things were meant for living, not looking at. That first evening, Thomas cooked their supper over the wood stove while Catherine watched from the kitchen table, memorizing every step. The meal was simple: fried beef, beans, and biscuits that were hard enough to break teeth. But it was hot and filling, and she was grateful. "Tomorrow, I'll show you around properly," Thomas said as they finished eating. "Introduce you to the animals, explain the daily chores. Fair warning, ranch work starts before dawn and doesn't end until after dark. It's not easy labor." Catherine straightened her shoulders. "I'm ready to learn." "We'll see," Thomas said, but his tone was kind rather than doubting. That night, Catherine lay in Sarah's bed, listening to sounds she couldn't identify. Something hooted in the darkness. Wind whistled through gaps in the walls. In the distance, an animal made a sound that could have been crying or singing. She thought about Charles, probably dining at his gentleman's club, surrounded by friends who would agree with whatever he said. She thought about her sister Margaret, safe in her Philadelphia parlor, pouring tea from china cups that had never known the touch of rough hands. For the first time in months, Catherine didn't cry herself to sleep. Dawn came with a rooster's crow that could wake the dead. Catherine stumbled from bed, her body stiff from the unfamiliar mattress and the wagon ride. Through her window, she could see Thomas already moving around the barn, a lantern in his hand creating a pool of golden light in the purple darkness. She dressed quickly and hurried to the kitchen, where coffee sat ready on the stove. Thomas must have made it before heading out to his morning chores. The thoughtfulness of the gesture warmed her more than the hot liquid itself. "Catherine," Thomas's voice carried across the yard. "Come meet the ladies." She found him in the chicken coop, a structure that smelled of hay and something else she couldn't name. Hens clucked and fluttered around his feet as he scattered grain from a bucket. "Ladies, meet Catherine," he announced solemnly. "She's going to be gathering your eggs from now on, so you'd best behave yourselves." "You talk to the chickens?" Catherine asked, amused despite her nervousness. "Why not? They're good listeners and they never argue back. Unlike some animals I could mention." He glanced toward the pasture where Thunder stood watching them. His ears pricked forward as if he understood every word. Thomas showed her how to reach under the hens for eggs, warning her that some of the birds were broody and would peck at intruders. Her first attempt resulted in a sharp pain across her knuckles and an indignant squawk from a red hen who clearly considered the eggs her personal property. "She got you good," Thomas observed, examining the scratch. "That's Henrietta. She's the boss around here, and she wants everyone to know it. Even you, especially me. I made the mistake of naming her after my Aunt Henrietta, who was just as ornery. Now I think the chicken believes she owns the place." Catherine found herself laughing, a sound that felt rusty from disuse. When had she last laughed with Charles? She couldn't remember. The morning brought lesson after lesson. How to milk the 2 cows without getting kicked. How to pump water from the well without straining her back. How to feed the horses while keeping her fingers safely away from their teeth. Each task revealed how little she knew about the basic work of staying alive. In Boston, servants had handled everything from cooking to cleaning to shopping. Catherine's biggest daily decision had been which dress to wear to which social event. "Don't look so defeated," Thomas said, finding her struggling with the butter churn after lunch. "Nobody expects you to learn everything in one day. Ranch life is different from city life, but it's not harder. Just different." "I don't understand the difference," Catherine admitted, her arms aching from the rhythmic motion of churning. Thomas leaned against the kitchen counter, considering her question. "In the city, you depend on other people for everything. Out here, you depend on yourself, your family, and your neighbors. When something breaks, you fix it. When you're hungry, you cook. When winter comes, you'd better have enough food stored up to last until spring. What if you can't do something? What if you don't know how? Then you learn. Or you trade work with someone who does know. Mrs. Henderson down the valley makes the best bread in 3 counties. But she can't shoe a horse to save her life. So she trades loaves for horseshoeing, and everybody wins." Catherine thought about this as she finally achieved something that might generously be called butter. In Boston, if she'd needed something, she'd simply purchased it. The idea of trading skills and labor seemed both foreign and appealing. That afternoon, Thomas took her to meet the cattle up close. The massive animals proved surprisingly gentle, allowing her to approach and even touch their warm sides. A calf with white spots wandered over to investigate her skirts, its rough tongue nearly knocking her over when it decided to taste the fabric. "They're like big dogs," Catherine marveled, stroking the calf's soft nose. "Don't let them hear you say that. They've got their pride." As the sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of gold and pink, Catherine helped Thomas with the evening chores. Her hands were blistered, her back ached, and her dress was stained with things she preferred not to identify. But she felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the deep satisfaction of useful work. "You did well today," Thomas said as they walked back to the house together. "Better than I expected, if I'm being honest. Did you think I'd give up and demand to be taken back to town? The thought crossed my mind. City ladies usually don't take to ranch life." Catherine stopped walking and turned to face him in the gathering darkness. "I'm not a city lady anymore, Thomas. I don't know what I am yet, but I know what I'm not." He studied her face in the lamplight spilling from the kitchen window. What are you then? I'm a woman with blisters on her hands and dirt under her fingernails who managed to get 3 eggs from Henrietta without losing any blood. That's more than I was yesterday. Thomas smiled, and this time it reached his eyes. That's a good start, Catherine. That's a very good start. As they prepared for their second night under the same roof, Catherine realized that for the first time since leaving Boston, she was looking forward to tomorrow. There would be more chores to learn, more skills to master, more ways to prove to herself that she was stronger than she'd ever imagined. But tonight, there was hot soup and fresh bread, the warmth of the kitchen stove, and the quiet companionship of a man who seemed to understand that sometimes the greatest kindness was simply giving someone a chance to discover who they really were. Thunder's wild neighing shattered the morning calm like glass breaking against stone. Catherine bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering as the sound of hoofbeats thundered past her window. Through the thin walls, she heard Thomas cursing in language that would make a preacher faint. She threw on her dress and rushed outside to find chaos erupting across the ranch. The pasture gate hung open, twisted on its hinges like a broken wing. Cattle scattered across the hills in every direction, their panicked mooing echoing off the mountains. Thomas stood in the middle of the yard, his hat in his hands, staring at the disaster with the expression of a man watching his future disappear over the horizon. What happened? Catherine gasped, still barefoot and breathless from running. Someone cut my fence lines, Thomas said, his voice deadly calm in the way that meant he was fighting to control his anger. Professional job too. Clean cuts, all in the right places to spook the herd. Catherine followed his gaze to where twisted metal lay scattered across the ground like silver snakes. The fence posts stood naked and useless, their purpose destroyed in the darkness while they slept. Who would do such a thing? Thomas's jaw tightened. Same folks who've been trying to buy this land for the past year. When a man won't sell, sometimes people try to convince him he should. The name hit Catherine like a bucket of cold water. The Baxter Company? You know them. She nodded slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking together in her mind. Charles mentioned them in his letters. His bank holds notes for several of their land purchases back east. He said they were expanding westward, buying up ranch properties for the railroad. Thomas spat in the dirt. Expanding is a polite word for it. They show up, make an offer that sounds generous until you realize they're planning to tear down everything you've built. When folks refuse to sell, bad things start happening. Fences get cut, water sources get poisoned, accidents happen to livestock. The weight of understanding settled over Catherine like a heavy blanket. They think I'm connected to Charles. They think I might be here to convince you to sell. Are you? The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Catherine met his gaze directly, seeing the doubt that flickered there like candlelight in wind. 3 weeks of shared work and growing trust could be destroyed by suspicion as easily as fences could be cut in the night. Thomas Garrett, if I were here to trick you into selling your ranch, do you honestly think I'd start by learning to milk cows and getting pecked by chickens? Wouldn't I be more likely to bat my eyelashes and talk about how wonderful it would be to have enough money to move somewhere more civilized? His expression softened slightly. That would be the smarter approach. I've never been accused of being too smart for my own good. Catherine gestured at the scattered cattle. Now, do you want to stand here discussing my possible secret loyalties? Or do you want to round up your livestock before they end up in the next county? The next 6 hours tested every muscle Catherine had discovered she possessed. Herding cattle, she learned, was nothing like the romantic songs made it sound. The animals had minds of their own and strong opinions about where they wanted to go, which was invariably the opposite direction from where they needed to be. Thunder proved invaluable, despite his difficult personality. The black stallion seemed to understand exactly what Thomas wanted before the commands were given, cutting off wandering steers and driving them back toward home with the skill of a dancer performing a complex routine. Catherine rode Thomas's gentler mare, a patient brown horse named Molly, who tolerated her inexperienced handling with the grace of a saint. By noon, they had recovered most of the scattered herd, though several animals remained missing in the distant hills. We'll find them tomorrow, Thomas said, wiping sweat from his forehead as they counted the cattle back into the main pasture. Right now, I need to repair these fences before dark. Catherine dismounted on legs that felt like water, every muscle screaming from the unaccustomed work. What can I do to help? You've done enough for one day. This is dangerous work. If the wire snaps under tension, it can cut a man in half. Then it's a good thing I'm not a man. Thomas opened his mouth to argue, then seemed to think better of it. You're as stubborn as thunder. You know that? I'll take that as a compliment. They worked until sunset, splicing new wire and resetting fence posts. Catherine's hands were raw from handling the metal, but she refused to quit. This ranch was becoming her home too, and she wouldn't stand by while others tried to destroy it. As they finished the last section of fence, a rider appeared on the horizon. Catherine shaded her eyes against the setting sun, trying to make out the figure approaching at an easy lope. That's Jim Peterson, Thomas said, recognizing the newcomer before Catherine could. Runs the spread south of here. Good man. But he wouldn't ride over this late unless something was wrong. Jim Peterson turned out to be a weathered man in his 50s with kind eyes and calloused hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. He declined Thomas's offer of coffee but accepted a drink of water from the well. Heard you had some trouble today, Jim said without preamble. Same thing happened to the Hendersons last week, and the Martinez family the week before that. All folks who refused to sell to Baxter Company? Thomas asked. Every last one. They're working their way through the valley, making life hard for anyone who won't take their money. Jim glanced at Catherine, clearly curious about the woman working alongside Thomas, but too polite to ask directly. Jim Peterson, meet Catherine, Thomas said simply. She's been helping me keep this place running. Jim touched his hat brim politely. Ma'am, you picked a challenging time to take up ranching. I'm learning that challenges often come whether you pick them or not, Catherine replied. The question is whether you face them or run away. Something in her tone seemed to satisfy Jim's unspoken questions. He nodded approvingly before turning back to Thomas. Reason I rode over was to tell you about the meeting tomorrow night. We're gathering at the Henderson place to discuss what to do about Baxter Company. Figure it's time to stand together instead of letting them pick us off one by one. I'll be there, Thomas promised. Bring the lady too, if she's willing. This affects everyone in the valley now. After Jim left, Catherine and Thomas sat on the front porch in the gathering darkness, too tired to do anything but watch the stars appear one by one in the vast Montana sky. Are you having second thoughts? Thomas asked quietly. About staying here, I mean. Today was just a sample of what Baxter Company can do when they want to convince someone to sell. Catherine considered the question seriously. In Boston, when faced with unpleasantness, she had always had the option of retreat, to her room, to her books, to the carefully maintained illusion that ugly things happen to other people. But here, there was nowhere to hide and no one else to handle the difficult decisions. Do you want me to have second thoughts? She asked instead of answering directly. No, Thomas said immediately, then seemed surprised by his own honesty. No, I don't. These past weeks, having you here has made this place feel like a home again instead of just a place where I work and sleep. Then I'm not going anywhere. Baxter Company. Cut fences, scattered cattle. None of it changes what I found here. And what's that? Catherine looked across the ranch that was becoming as much hers as his, at the repaired fences that bore the marks of her own hands, at the man beside her who had given her the chance to discover her own strength. Purpose, she said simply. For the first time in my life, I'm exactly where I belong. The next evening brought neighbors Catherine had never met, ranchers and their families gathering in the Henderson parlor to discuss their common problem. She had expected to be treated as an outsider, but the shared threat seemed to override questions about her background or her right to be there. Mrs. Henderson served coffee and cake while the men discussed strategy and the women offered their own insights with the practical wisdom of people who knew what it meant to lose everything. They tried to buy us out 3 times, said Maria Martinez, a small woman with fierce dark eyes. Each time, the offer got smaller and the pressure got stronger. Last week, they poisoned our water source. My youngest son got sick drinking from the creek. The law won't help us, added Bob Henderson, a big man with gentle hands who clearly adored his tiny, determined wife. Sheriffs either bought or scared. Maybe both. So what do we do? Asked Thomas. We can't fight them with lawyers if they own the lawyers. We can't trust the law if they've bought the law. We fight them the way our grandfathers fought, said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned to look at old Pete Kowalski, who rarely spoke but commanded respect when he did. Not with guns, but with unity. They're counting on us to be alone, scattered, easy to pick off one by one. What if we weren't? What are you suggesting, Pete? Jim Peterson asked. I'm suggesting we stop thinking like individual ranchers and start thinking like a community. We share resources, share work, share the burden of standing up to them. Make it cost them more to push us out than it's worth. The idea sparked discussion that lasted well past midnight. By the time the meeting broke up, they had formed what they half-jokingly called the Stubborn Ranchers Association, a mutual aid society that would share labor, resources, and the responsibility of standing watch against further sabotage. You realize what this means? Thomas said as they rode home under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch. We're not just standing up for our individual ranches anymore. We're taking responsibility for the whole valley. Catherine adjusted her grip on Molly's reins, still getting used to riding in darkness. Is that what worries you? The responsibility? What worries me is what happens if we fail. It's one thing to lose your own place, but when you're fighting for your neighbors too, then we don't fail, Catherine said with quiet determination. Simple as that. Thomas turned to look at her in the moonlight. You say that like you believe it's possible. I have to believe it's possible. I've spent too many years accepting that other people had all the power, that my only choice was to submit or run away. I won't do that anymore, Thomas. Not for Baxter Company, not for anyone. As they approached the ranch, Catherine noticed something that made her pull Molly to a stop. Thomas, look at the house. A warm golden light spilled from every window, as if someone had lit every lamp and candle they owned. But they had left the house dark, and there was no wind to blow out carefully extinguished flames. Someone's inside, Thomas said grimly, his hand moving to the rifle in his saddle scabbard. They approached carefully, listening for voices or movement. But the house was silent except for the familiar creak of old wood settling. Thomas dismounted first, motioning for Catherine to stay back as he climbed the porch steps. The front door stood slightly ajar. On the kitchen table, they found an envelope with Thomas's name written in elegant script. Inside was a single sheet of expensive paper bearing a message that made Catherine's blood run cold. Mr. Garrett, your charming guest has excellent taste in husbands. Perhaps she should choose more carefully in the future. Some investments yield better returns than others. A friend. Catherine sank into a kitchen chair, the implications crashing over her like a cold wave. They know about Charles. They know why I'm here. How could they know? Money talks, especially when it belongs to powerful people. Charles has connections everywhere, and Baxter Company has the resources to buy information. Catherine's voice shook with anger rather than fear. They're threatening me to get to you. Thomas crumpled the letter in his fist. Let them try. But as they checked the house for other signs of intrusion, Catherine couldn't shake the feeling that their peaceful weeks of building something together were coming to an end. The outside world had found them, and it was bringing all the complications she had hoped to leave behind. The question now was whether what they had built together was strong enough to survive the storm that was coming. Catherine's coffee cup crashed to the kitchen floor as she heard Charles's voice drift through the open window. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird as she crept to the side window and peered through the lace curtains she had sewn just last week. There he stood in his perfect gray suit, his gold watch chain glinting in the morning sun, as he gestured toward the house with the same commanding hand that had once controlled every aspect of her life. 2 other men flanked him. One wore a sheriff's badge that caught the light, while the other clutched a leather folder thick with official-looking papers. "She's legally my wife," Charles was saying to Thomas, who stood with his arms crossed, blocking the path to the front door. "I have every right to take her home where she belongs." Catherine's mouth went dry. The sheriff meant Charles had followed through on his threat. The legal system that had never protected her from her husband's neglect now stood ready to force her back into his control. "Rights on paper don't mean much if the woman doesn't want to go," Thomas replied, his voice steady as granite. "Catherine makes her own choices here." The man with the folder stepped forward, unfolding what looked like a court document. "Mr. Garrett, I'm afraid the law is quite clear on this matter. Mrs. Henley left Boston without her husband's permission, taking items that legally belong to the Henley household." "What items?" Thomas asked. Charles smiled, that cold smile Catherine remembered too well. "Her wedding dress, for one. A family heirloom worth considerably more than this ranch, I'd wager. Several pieces of jewelry. Books from my personal library." Catherine's hands flew to her throat. The only jewelry she wore was her mother's simple silver locket, the one thing she'd owned before marriage. The books Charles mentioned were her own childhood favorites that she'd brought to their marriage. As for the wedding dress, it lay in tatters in a trunk, ruined by tears and travel. "You're going to have to let me search the premises," the sheriff said, his tone apologetic but firm. "If stolen property is on these grounds." "There's nothing stolen here," Thomas said, but Catherine could hear the uncertainty creeping into his voice. How could he know what Charles might claim? How could he protect her from laws written by men like her husband? "I think we should settle this peacefully," came a new voice from behind the house. Catherine's heart sank as she recognized Mrs. Fletcher, the town's most notorious gossip, approaching with 2 other women in tow. Poor Catherine has been through quite enough scandal already. The women wore the same expression Catherine remembered from Boston, the carefully controlled faces of people who had decided her fate before hearing her side of the story. Their presence meant the entire town would know about this confrontation before sunset. "Mrs. Fletcher," Charles said, tipping his hat with practiced charm. "How kind of you to concern yourself with my wife's welfare. As you can see, I've come to bring her home where she can receive proper care." "Proper care?" Mrs. Fletcher repeated, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of fresh scandal. "Yes, well, we've all wondered about the arrangements here. A single woman living with a widowed man, no matter how temporarily." Catherine felt her cheeks burn. She'd been so focused on building a new life that she'd forgotten how quickly whispers could destroy a woman's reputation. In this small town, perception mattered more than truth. "There's been nothing improper," Thomas said firmly, but Catherine saw how the other women exchanged glances. In their minds, her guilt was already established. "Of course not," Charles said smoothly. "Catherine has always been the picture of virtue, which is precisely why she belongs in Boston, surrounded by proper society, rather than—" He gestured dismissively at the ranch. "Whatever this is supposed to be." Catherine pressed her back against the kitchen wall, her mind racing. She could stay hidden and let the men decide her fate, as women were expected to do. She could surrender to Charles and return to a life of quiet desperation. Or she could walk outside and fight for the first happiness she'd ever known. The kitchen door felt heavier than a mountain as she pushed it open. "Catherine!" Charles exclaimed, his face lighting up with an actor's perfect joy. "Darling, thank goodness. When you disappeared from Boston, I feared the worst. I've been sick with worry." Every person in the yard turned to stare at her. Catherine felt their eyes like weight on her shoulders, judging, measuring, deciding whether she was a victim to be pitted or a troublemaker to be controlled. "You told me our marriage was over," she said quietly. "Your letter said you couldn't continue the charade." Charles's expression shifted to one of gentle concern. "My dear, you misunderstood. I was frustrated about business matters, not our relationship." Surely you know I would never abandon my beloved wife. The sheriff cleared his throat. Ma'am, if you could just gather your belongings, we can have this whole matter settled quickly. What if I don't want to go? Catherine asked. Want? Mrs. Fletcher laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Child, want has nothing to do with marriage. You made vows before God and man. Those vows don't disappear just because you decide to play house with another man. Catherine has been nothing but honorable, Thomas said sharply. She's worked hard, contributed to this ranch, and deserves respect. Respect. The man with the legal papers looked amused. Mr. Garrett, with all due respect, you've been harboring another man's wife. In most places, that's grounds for serious legal action. Catherine saw Thomas's jaw tighten. She was destroying his life just by being here. Her problems were becoming his problems, and soon the whole community would turn against him for defending her. I'll go, she said suddenly. Just give me a few minutes to pack my things. Catherine, no, Thomas said, but she could hear the relief mixed with his protest. Part of him had to know this was the sensible choice. She turned toward the house, but Charles caught her arm. His grip was gentle enough that the watching crowd wouldn't see anything wrong, but his fingers pressed into her flesh with familiar possessiveness. I knew you'd come to your senses, he said softly, his breath warm against her ear. We'll take the afternoon train back to Boston. I've already bought your ticket. The presumption in those words, that he'd known she would surrender, that he'd planned her capitulation down to the train schedule, sent anger shooting through Catherine's veins like lightning. Let go of my arm, she said. Catherine, you're being difficult. These good people don't need to see you acting hysterical. I said let go. Charles's grip tightened. Lower your voice. You're embarrassing yourself. The only embarrassing thing here, Catherine said, loud enough for everyone to hear, is a man who throws away his wife like trash and then expects her to be grateful when he decides he wants her back. Gasps rippled through the small crowd. Women didn't speak to their husbands this way, especially not in public. Catherine was breaking every rule of proper behavior, and she found she didn't care. You wrote me a letter, she continued, pulling free of Charles's grip. You told me I was a disappointment. You said I was boring and that you regretted marrying me. You gave me $50 and told me to make arrangements for my future because you were done pretending to be happy. That's enough, Charles said, his mask of gentle concern finally slipping. You're clearly overwrought. Sheriff, please escort my wife to the wagon. Now hold on, the sheriff said uncomfortably. If the lady has complaints about her treatment, her complaints are irrelevant. The man with the papers interrupted. The law recognizes marriage as a binding contract. Personal feelings don't void legal obligations. Catherine looked around at the faces surrounding her. Some curious, some disapproving, some genuinely concerned. These people would decide her fate based on their understanding of right and wrong, but none of them had lived her life. You want to talk about legal obligations? She asked. What about a husband's obligation to provide for his wife? Charles left me with $50 and told me to disappear. What about his obligation to honor and cherish? He spent more money on his cigars each month than he ever spent on me. Financial disputes can be resolved between husband and wife, the legal man said dismissively. The point is, you are his wife and wives belong with their husbands. Even when their husbands don't want them, even then. The simple cruelty of those two words hung in the air like smoke. Even then. Even when unloved, unwanted, discarded like a broken piece of furniture. A wife's desires meant nothing. A wife's happiness was irrelevant. A wife existed to fulfill her husband's needs, regardless of her own. Catherine looked at Thomas, who watched her with those steady gray eyes. He wasn't demanding anything from her. He wasn't insisting she stay or go. He was simply waiting for her to choose, ready to support whatever decision she made. I won't go, she said clearly. I won't return to a marriage where I was treated like an unwanted burden. I won't spend the rest of my life pretending to be grateful for scraps of affection. Charles's face darkened. You don't have a choice in the matter. Yes, she does, Thomas said quietly. This is American territory, not some medieval kingdom. Women have rights here. What rights? Charles laughed. The right to cook your meals and warm your bed? Don't pretend this is about Catherine's freedom. You want her for the same reason any man wants a woman. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Catherine saw Thomas's hands clench into fists, saw the muscle in his jaw twitch with barely controlled anger. That's not true, she said before Thomas could respond. Thomas has never treated me as anything less than an equal partner. He values my opinions, respects my work, and treats me like a human being instead of a possession. How touching, Charles said sarcastically. But it doesn't change the facts. You're my wife, Catherine. You wear my name. You made vows to me before God. Those vows don't become meaningless just because you've developed romantic feelings for another man. You're right, Catherine said suddenly. I did make vows. I promised to love, honor, and obey you. But you made vows too, Charles. You promised to love and cherish me, in sickness and in health, for better or worse. When did you last honor those promises? Charles opened his mouth to respond, but Catherine wasn't finished. When was the last time you asked about my happiness? When was the last time you treated me as anything more than a decoration for your dining room? You broke our marriage vows long before I left Boston. You just expect me to keep honoring mine. The crowd had fallen silent, uncertain how to process this public dismantling of what should have been a private matter. Catherine could see the doubt creeping into some faces, the recognition that perhaps there were two sides to this story. Enough, Charles said sharply. Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man for harboring stolen property and alienation of affections. And I want my wife returned to me immediately. Ma'am, the sheriff said heavily, I'm afraid the law is on your husband's side. If you don't come willingly, I'll have to. You'll have to what? Catherine asked. Drag me to the train station? Tie me up and throw me in a wagon? Is that what justice looks like in Montana territory? The sheriff's face reddened. Now, ma'am, it won't come to that if you'll just be reasonable. Reasonable, Catherine repeated. It's reasonable for a man to abandon his wife and then demand her return when it's convenient. It's reasonable for the law to treat women like livestock. But it's unreasonable for a woman to choose her own path. She looked around at the faces watching her. Some hostile, some confused, but a few showing the first signs of understanding. Mrs. Fletcher's stern expression had softened slightly, and one of the younger women was nodding slowly. I have a question for all of you, Catherine said. If your husband wrote you a letter saying he was done with your marriage, gave you $50, and told you to make your own arrangements, what would you do? Would you go home and pretend nothing had happened? Would you wait patiently for him to change his mind? That's different, Mrs. Fletcher said, but her voice lacked its earlier certainty. How is it different? Well, that is, my husband would never. Your husband might never, Catherine agreed. But mine did, and now he wants me to pretend it didn't happen. He wants me to return to a marriage where I was already unwanted, already discarded, already told I was a burden he couldn't bear. She turned to face Charles directly. I won't do it. I won't spend the rest of my life walking on eggshells, wondering when you'll decide I'm inconvenient again. I won't pretend to be grateful for a love that comes and goes based on your moods. You don't have a choice, Charles said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I'm making a choice right now, Catherine said. I choose to stay here, where I'm valued for who I am, not what I can do for someone else. I choose to work hard and earn my place in the world, rather than exist as someone else's property. The law, the man with the papers began. The law is wrong, Catherine said simply, and someday enough people will recognize that to change it. But until then, I'll live by a higher law, the one that says every person has the right to pursue happiness, the right to be treated with dignity, and the right to leave situations that harm them. The silence stretched like a held breath. Catherine could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of every stare, could sense the moment balancing on the edge of a knife. Then Thomas stepped forward, positioning himself between Catherine and the men who wanted to take her away. "The lady has made her choice," he said quietly, "and I'll stand by it." The sound of wagon wheels fading into the distance left behind a silence so complete that Catherine could hear her own breathing. Charles was gone, along with the sheriff and the man with his legal papers, but their threats hung in the air like storm clouds. They would be back, Charles had promised. They would return with more authority, more legal power, more men to enforce laws that treated women like property. Catherine sat on the porch steps, her legs too shaky to support her weight. The confrontation had drained every ounce of strength from her body, leaving her feeling like a rag doll that had lost its stuffing. Mrs. Fletcher and the other women had departed quickly after Charles's wagon disappeared, their faces carefully blank to hide their thoughts about what they'd witnessed. "You know what this means," Thomas said quietly, settling beside her on the wooden steps. "Word will spread. People will take sides. Some will think you're a runaway wife who needs to be returned to her husband. Others might understand, but they'll be afraid to say so out loud." Catherine nodded, staring at her hands. The skin was rougher now than it had been 3 months ago, marked by honest work and exposure to the elements. These weren't the soft, pale hands of a Boston lady anymore. They belonged to someone who had learned to milk cows and mend fences and make bread from scratch. "I've ruined everything for you," she said. "Your reputation in town, your standing in the community. People will think you're a man who steals other men's wives." "Let them think what they want," Thomas replied. "I know what I am, and so do you. That's enough." But Catherine knew it wasn't enough. In small communities like this one, reputation mattered more than truth. A man's word was his bond, and Thomas's word would be questioned now because of her. Neighbors might stop trading with him. The bank might question his loans. The very foundation of his life could crumble because he'd chosen to defend her. "Maybe I should have gone," she said softly. "Maybe it would have been easier for everyone if I just don't." Thomas's voice carried a sharp edge she'd never heard before. "Don't you dare start thinking that way. What's easy isn't always what's right, and what's legal isn't always what's just." He stood up and walked to the porch railing, gripping it with both hands as he stared out at the mountains. "I watched my first wife die slowly, day by day, and there wasn't a damn thing I could do to save her. But today I had a chance to save someone. To stand up for what's right instead of what's convenient. I won't apologize for taking that chance." Catherine felt tears burn behind her eyes. "But what if they come back with more men? What if they arrest you for harboring a fugitive or whatever legal term they want to use?" "Then I'll deal with that when it happens," Thomas said simply. "But I won't live in fear of what might be. I spent too many months after Sarah died just existing, just getting through each day without really living. I won't go back to that." He turned to face her, his gray eyes serious. "The question is, what do you want to do? Really want, not what you think you should do or what would be easiest for everyone else. If you could have any life you wanted, what would it look like?" Catherine closed her eyes and tried to imagine a world where she could choose freely. In that world, she saw herself continuing to wake up in this house, to share coffee with Thomas in the early morning light, to tend the garden and manage the household books and feel like a partner instead of a burden. In that world, she could build something meaningful with her own hands instead of simply existing as decoration in someone else's life. "I want to stay," she said finally, "but I want to do it right. I want to find a way that doesn't destroy your life or make you a target for legal trouble." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then we need to be smart about this. Charles is right about one thing. The law is on his side as long as you're legally his wife. But there might be ways around that." "What do you mean?" "I mean, we need to talk to people who know more about legal matters than we do. Find out what options exist for women in your situation. There might be ways to challenge the marriage or seek protection under territorial law." Catherine felt a spark of hope. You think there's really a chance? I think there's always a chance if you're willing to fight for it, Thomas said. But it won't be easy. We'll need allies, people who believe in what we're doing and are willing to stand with us. Over the next few days, Catherine discovered that allies could come from unexpected places. Dr. Marcus Webb, the town's physician, stopped by the ranch on the pretense of checking on Catherine's health, but really to offer his support. He'd seen too many women trapped in marriages that slowly destroyed their spirits, he said. If Catherine needed someone to testify about her mental and physical condition, he would gladly do so. Martha Priscall, who ran the town's general store with her husband, came by with fresh eggs and a quiet promise that whatever Catherine needed from the store would always be available, regardless of what other people might say. Martha had been widowed young and forced to support herself for several years before remarrying. She understood what it meant for a woman to stand on her own. Even more surprising was the visit from Father Miguel, the traveling priest who served the scattered Catholic families in the territory. He spoke with Thomas privately for over an hour, and when he emerged from the conversation, his face was thoughtful rather than condemning. The Church teaches that marriage is sacred, he told Catherine, but it also teaches that love is sacred, and that human dignity is sacred. Sometimes these teachings come into conflict, and we must choose which sacred principle to honor most. These conversations gave Catherine courage, but they also made her realize how much she still had to learn about building a life on her own terms. She'd spent so many years following other people's rules that she wasn't sure how to create her own. Thomas seemed to understand this without being told. He began involving her more deeply in the ranch's business decisions, teaching her to read the account books and understand the seasonal rhythms of cattle raising. When neighboring ranchers came by to discuss water rights or fence repairs, he included her in the conversations as an equal partner rather than excusing her to tend to women's work. "You have a good head for numbers," he observed one evening as they reviewed the ranch's finances by lamplight. "And you ask questions I wouldn't think to ask. We make a good team." Catherine looked up from the ledger she'd been studying. "Do you really mean that? Or are you just trying to make me feel useful?" "I mean it," Thomas said seriously. "You've improved this place in ways that go beyond cooking and cleaning. You've made me think differently about how to organize the work, how to plan for the future. I was just surviving before you came. Now I feel like I'm actually living again." The honesty in his voice made Catherine's chest tighten with emotion. "I feel the same way. For the first time in my life, I feel like I matter. Like my thoughts and opinions have value." "They do have value," Thomas said firmly. "And any man who couldn't see that was a fool." That night, Catherine lay in her narrow bed in the small room off the kitchen and thought about the future. Charles would return eventually, she was certain of that. He was too proud to accept defeat, too accustomed to getting his way to simply give up and go home. When he came back, he would bring more legal pressure, more social pressure, more ways to force her into compliance. But she wouldn't be the same woman he'd tried to drag away a week ago. Every day at the ranch had made her stronger, more confident in her own judgment, more certain that she deserved better than a life of quiet desperation. She'd learned that she could work hard and contribute meaningfully to something larger than herself. She'd discovered that respect was more valuable than security, and that partnership was more fulfilling than protection. Most importantly, she'd learned that her worth wasn't determined by someone else's desire to keep her around. She had value simply because she existed, because she could think and feel and contribute and care. That knowledge was like armor against all the ways the world tried to tell women they were less than whole. The next morning brought a letter that changed everything. Thomas found it slipped under the front door when he went out to do the morning chores, and his face was grim as he handed it to Catherine. "From Charles?" she asked, recognizing the expensive paper and formal handwriting. "Read it," Thomas said simply. Catherine unfolded the letter with trembling hands. "Catherine, since you seem determined to persist in this foolish rebellion, I have decided to make things simple for both of us. I am filing for divorce on the grounds of desertion and adultery. By the time you receive this letter, the papers will already be filed with the court in Boston. You should know that this action will ruin your reputation completely. No respectable family will associate with a divorced woman, and you will find it nearly impossible to secure decent employment. But perhaps that is what you wanted, to burn all bridges to civilized society. I have also spoken with the territorial authorities about your theft of personal property. If you attempt to sell or dispose of any items that belong to our household, you will face criminal charges. Consider yourself free, Catherine. I hope you find that freedom is worthless as I suspect it will be. Charles. Catherine read the letter twice, then a third time, before the full meaning sank in. Charles was divorcing her. He was cutting her loose completely, burning every bridge between them with the same casual cruelty he'd shown in his original letter. He's freeing me, she whispered, hardly daring to believe it. Looks that way, Thomas said. Though he's trying to make it sound like a punishment. Catherine laughed suddenly, a sound of pure relief bubbling up from her chest. A punishment? He's giving me exactly what I wanted, legal freedom from a marriage that was already dead. He thinks he's destroying me, but he's actually saving me. Thomas smiled at her joy, but his expression remained cautious. It's not quite that simple. Divorce carries a stigma, especially for women. Some people will blame you regardless of the circumstances. Let them blame me, Catherine said, folding the letter carefully. I'd rather be free and blamed than married and miserable. Besides, I don't need the approval of people who would judge me for leaving an unhappy marriage. For the first time since Charles had appeared at their door, Catherine felt truly hopeful. The legal battle she'd been dreading wouldn't be necessary. She wouldn't have to prove her case in court or navigate complex territorial laws. Charles's pride had done what her courage alone might not have accomplished. It had set her free. There's something else, Thomas said quietly. Something I need to ask you now that this situation has changed. Catherine looked up at him, noting the uncertainty in his expression. What is it? I know you've been through hell with marriage. I know you have every reason to be wary of making that kind of commitment again. But I also know that what we have here is different. We're partners already in everything but name. He paused, searching for the right words. When you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'd like to ask you to marry me. Not because society expects it, not because you need protection or I need a housekeeper, but because I love you. Because I want to build a life with you as my equal partner in everything. Catherine felt her heart skip a beat. This was nothing like Charles's proposal, which had been more of an announcement than a request. Thomas was offering her a choice, a partnership, a future built on mutual respect and genuine affection. Yes, she said simply. When the divorce is final, when I'm legally free to make that choice, yes. I would like nothing more than to be your wife, your real wife, your equal partner, your chosen companion. Thomas's smile was like sunrise after a long night. He pulled her into his arms, holding her close as the morning light streamed through the kitchen windows. Outside, the world was waking up to another day full of possibilities, and for the first time in her life, Catherine felt ready to embrace whatever came next. She was no longer someone else's abandoned property. She was a woman who had chosen her own path, fought for her own freedom, and found her own worth. That knowledge would sustain her through whatever challenges lay ahead. The shotgun blast cracked through the December morning like thunder, sending snow tumbling from the pine branches above Catherine's head. She froze on the cabin steps, her heart hammering against her ribs as Thomas burst through the door behind her, rifle in hand, his face set in hard lines she'd never seen before. Get inside, he said quietly, his eyes scanning the tree line where dark shapes moved between the trunks. Now. Catherine didn't argue. She'd learned enough about ranch life to know that when Thomas Garrett spoke in that tone, you listened. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around her like a blanket, but she couldn't stop shaking as she pressed herself against the wall beside the window. Through the frosted glass, she watched Thomas move across the yard with the careful steps of a man who knew danger when he saw it. Wolf Pack, he called back to her, his voice carrying across the crisp air. Big one. They've been hitting ranches all week, looking for easy meals before the worst of winter sets in. The wedding was supposed to happen today. Reverend Mills had ridden out from town yesterday, grumbling about the weather but carrying his worn Bible and the legal papers that would make Catherine's new life official. He was probably warming himself by their fire right now, waiting for a ceremony that might not happen if those wolves decided the ranch looked like a good place to hunt. Another shot rang out closer this time. Catherine heard Thomas shout something she couldn't make out, followed by the sound of running feet. Her hands found the heavy iron poker by the fireplace, gripping it so tight her knuckles went white. She might be a city girl, but she wasn't helpless. Not anymore. The door slammed open and Thomas stumbled inside, breathing hard, snow melting in his dark hair. "They're gone," he said, setting his rifle against the wall. "For now. But they'll be back when the sun goes down." "What about the wedding?" Catherine asked, hating how small her voice sounded. Thomas looked at her standing there in Sarah's blue dress, the one she'd spent 3 days altering to fit her smaller frame, and something soft flickered in his storm-gray eyes. "Reverend Mills is tough as old leather. He's married couples during Indian raids and blizzards that could freeze a man solid. A few wolves won't scare him off." But even as he spoke, they both knew this wasn't how either of them had pictured their wedding day. Catherine had dreamed of something simple but beautiful, maybe with wildflowers and sunshine and the feeling that the whole world was celebrating their choice to build a life together. Instead, she was holding a poker like a weapon while wolves prowled outside and the wind howled through the gaps in the cabin walls. "Maybe we should wait," she said, the words tasting bitter in her mouth. "Until spring when the weather's better and new." "No." Thomas crossed the room in 3 quick steps and took her hands in his, poker and all. "I've waited long enough to start living again. We both have. If we're going to do this, we're going to do it right, wolves or no wolves." The ceremony happened in the kitchen, with Reverend Mills standing between the stove and the table while Catherine and Thomas faced each other across a space that smelled of coffee and bacon and the soap Catherine used to scrub the floors. The preacher's voice boomed loud enough to be heard over the wind, reading words about love and commitment that seemed to take on extra weight when spoken in a room where every object spoke of the daily work of caring for each other. "Do you, Thomas Garrett, take Catherine to be your wife?" "I do," Thomas said, and Catherine heard in those 2 words all the things he'd never said out loud, the loneliness he'd carried since Sarah died, the hope he'd begun to feel again, the promise that she would never have to face the world alone. "Do you, Catherine, take Thomas to be your husband?" "I do," she whispered and meant it with every part of her heart. The kiss was soft and sweet and tasted like the future. But before either of them could say another word, the sound of howling rose from the forest, closer than before, and they all remembered that this was Montana territory in the dead of winter, where love was something you fought for every single day. The weeks that followed tested them in ways Catherine had never imagined. The wolves came back again and again, forcing Thomas to spend his nights in the barn with the cattle while Catherine huddled in the cabin with a loaded shotgun across her knees. The cold was so fierce it cracked the windows and turned the water in the wash basin to solid ice. Their food stores ran lower than Thomas had planned, and more than once Catherine went to bed hungry so he could have enough strength for the heavy work that kept them all alive. But somehow, in the middle of all that hardship, something beautiful began to grow. Catherine learned to read the signs that meant Thomas was worried, the way he rubbed the back of his neck when he thought she wasn't looking, the careful way he counted their remaining supplies. Thomas learned to notice when Catherine was trying too hard to be brave, and he'd find small ways to remind her that she didn't have to carry everything alone. They developed a language of looks and touches that spoke louder than words. When the blizzard lasted for 6 days straight and they couldn't leave the cabin, they discovered they could talk for hours about everything and nothing, their childhoods, their dreams, the small daily miracles that made life worth living even when it was hard. "I never told you about my sister Ruth," Catherine said one evening as they sat by the fire, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder while the wind rattled the shutters. "She was 2 years older than me and she could play piano like an angel. Mother always said Ruth would marry a rich man and live in a mansion with servants and beautiful clothes." "What happened to her?" Thomas asked, his voice rumbling through his chest. "Fever took her when she was 16. After that, I became the daughter who had to marry well, who had to make up for all the dreams that died with Ruth." Catherine was quiet for a moment, watching the flames dance in the fireplace. "I spent so many years trying to be the person my family needed me to be. Then I spent more years trying to be the wife Charles wanted. I forgot there was a person underneath all those expectations." Thomas's arm tightened around her. "What kind of person?" Catherine smiled, feeling something light and free unfurl in her chest. "The kind who likes getting her hands dirty in the garden. The kind who thinks coffee tastes better when you make it strong enough to wake the dead. The kind who'd rather mend a fence than sit in a parlor making polite conversation about nothing." "Good thing," Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Because that's exactly the kind of person I need." The spring thaw brought its own challenges. The creek flooded, washing out part of their pasture fence and forcing them to move the cattle to higher ground. Catherine ruined 3 batches of bread before she finally got the knack of baking with the temperamental old stove. Thomas caught pneumonia and spent 2 weeks in bed while Catherine learned to do the morning chores by herself, her hands raw and bleeding by the time he was well enough to help again. But they also had their first real success together when the vegetable garden Catherine planted produced more food than they could eat. She learned to preserve vegetables in glass jars, filling the cellar with neat rows of green beans and carrots and beets that would feed them through the next winter. Thomas taught her to ride his gentlest mare, and by summer she could check the fence lines almost as well as he could. The neighbors began to accept them as a real couple rather than a scandal to whisper about. Mrs. Henderson from the next ranch over started bringing Catherine fabric scraps and recipes. Old Jake Morrison, who'd been skeptical about a city woman making it on a ranch, tipped his hat to Catherine when he saw her herding cattle like she'd been born to it. But the real test came in August when a letter arrived with a Boston postmark and Catherine's maiden name written in handwriting she recognized with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Thomas found her sitting on the porch steps, the unopened letter trembling in her hands, tears streaming down her face. He didn't say anything, just sat down beside her and waited until she was ready to tell him what had knocked the wind out of her so completely. "It's from Charles," she finally whispered. "Even after everything, even after the divorce papers and the new marriage, he won't let me go." Thomas took the letter from her hands and tore it into pieces without reading it, letting the wind scatter the fragments across the yard like snow. "Whatever he has to say doesn't matter anymore," he said firmly. "You're not the woman who left Boston. You're Catherine Garrett now, and Catherine Garrett doesn't have to listen to anything Charles Henley has to say." That night, as they lay in bed listening to the sounds of the ranch settling around them, cattle lowing softly in the distance, the creek babbling over stones, and owl calling from the barn, Catherine realized something that made her heart feel larger than her chest could hold. She was home. Not just in this place, but in her own skin, in the life she'd chosen, in the daily miracle of being loved for exactly who she was rather than who someone else wanted her to be. For the first time since she was a little girl, Catherine Garrett fell asleep without worrying about tomorrow. The scream that shattered the dawn quiet sent Thomas bolt upright in bed, his hand already reaching for the rifle he kept beside the headboard. But this wasn't a sound of danger, it was pure joy, the kind of noise that could only come from someone discovering something wonderful beyond their wildest dreams. Catherine stood in the doorway of their bedroom, her face glowing with a light Thomas had never seen before, one hand pressed against her still flat belly, the other holding a letter that shook with her trembling fingers. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice breaking on his name. "I'm going to have a baby." The words hit him like a physical blow, knocking the breath from his lungs and making his heart stutter in his chest. For a moment, he couldn't move, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but stare at his wife as if she'd just told him she could fly. Then reality crashed over him in waves, joy and terror and hope and fear all tangled together until he couldn't tell where one feeling ended and another began. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. Catherine nodded, laughing through tears that sparkled like diamonds on her cheeks. "Dr. Patterson confirmed it yesterday when I went to town. I wanted to wait until I was certain before I told you. Thomas, we're going to be parents." He crossed the room in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, spinning her around until they were both dizzy and laughing and crying at the same time. When he finally set her down, he kept his hands on her face, memorizing every detail of this moment, the way the morning light caught in her hair, the wonder in her eyes, the smile that made her look like she was lit from within. "I thought, after Sarah died, I thought this would never happen for me," he said, his voice thick with tears he wasn't ashamed to shed. "I thought I'd used up all my chances at happiness." "We get to try again," Catherine said softly, covering his hands with hers. "We get to build something new together, something that belongs to both of us." But even as they held each other and planned for the future, neither of them could have imagined how much their world was about to change. The pregnancy wasn't easy. Catherine spent the first 3 months so sick she could barely keep water down, let alone the hearty meals she learned to cook for Thomas. He took over most of the household work without complaint, though his attempts at laundry left their clothes a peculiar shade of gray and his cooking could charitably be described as filling rather than tasty. "I married you for better or worse," he reminded her one morning as he brought her weak tea and dry toast, the only things her stomach could tolerate. "This definitely counts as worse, so I figure I'm getting practice for keeping my promises." As autumn deepened into winter, Catherine's strength returned, but new worries took its place. The nearest doctor was 2 days' ride away, and winter storms could make the roads impassable for weeks at a time. What if something went wrong? What if the baby came early? What if she couldn't handle the pain or didn't know what to do or lost the child the way so many women did in this harsh country? Thomas must have seen the fear in her eyes because one snowy December evening he surprised her with a visitor. Mrs. Elena Rodriguez rode up to their cabin on a sturdy mare, her saddlebags bulging with supplies and her weathered face creased with the kind of smile that made people trust her instantly. "Your husband sent word that you might need some help," she said in accented English, dismounting with the ease of someone who'd been riding horses longer than walking. "I've delivered more babies than I can count, including my own 6 children. Mind if an old woman stays for a while?" Elena had been a midwife in Mexico before she and her husband moved north to start a ranch. She'd learned her skills from her grandmother, who'd learned from her grandmother before that, in an unbroken chain of women helping women through the most dangerous and beautiful moments of their lives. Over the next few months, she taught Catherine everything she needed to know about birth and babies and the fierce strength that lived inside every woman's body. "Pain is not your enemy," Elena told her one afternoon as they sat by the fire, knitting tiny blankets and booties. "Pain is your body's way of bringing your child into the world. Trust it. Trust yourself. Women have been doing this since the beginning of time, and you are stronger than you know." The baby came on a warm April morning when the creek was running high with snowmelt and the air smelled of new grass and possibility. Catherine labored for 12 hours, with Elena coaching her through each contraction and Thomas pacing the kitchen like a caged wolf, jumping at every sound from the bedroom. When the baby's first cry filled the cabin, Thomas burst through the door like his hair was on fire, his face white with worry until he saw Catherine smiling at him with tired but radiant eyes. In her arms, wrapped in one of the blankets she'd spent months knitting, was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen, a perfect little girl with dark hair and lungs strong enough to wake the dead. "Sarah Rose Garrett," Catherine said softly, stroking the baby's impossibly soft cheek. "Sarah for new beginnings, and Rose because she's going to bloom wherever she's planted." Thomas sank into the chair beside the bed, his big, calloused hands shaking as he reached out to touch his daughter's tiny fingers. When she wrapped her whole fist around his thumb, he looked like someone had just handed him the moon and stars wrapped up in a baby blanket. "Hello, little one," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Welcome to the world." The next 2 years passed in a blur of sleepless nights and first smiles and the daily miracle of watching a tiny person become herself. Sarah was walking by 10 months, talking by 18 months, and causing trouble from the moment she figured out how to open doors. She had Catherine's stubborn streak and Thomas's adventurous spirit, which made for some interesting days on the ranch. Catherine learned to nurse a baby while riding fence, to cook dinner with a toddler clinging to her skirts, and to function on 3 hours of sleep like it was perfectly normal. Thomas discovered that fatherhood meant having tiny clothes mixed in with the laundry, strange toys scattered across every surface, and a love so fierce it sometimes scared him with its intensity. But more than that, they discovered that being a family meant something different than either of them had expected. It wasn't just the 3 of them against the world, it was the 3 of them building a world worth living in, day by day, choice by choice, act of love by act of love. The ranch prospered. Their cattle herd grew strong and healthy, their crops produced enough to sell as well as eat. And their small house expanded to include a proper nursery and a parlor big enough for the neighbors who stopped by regularly now that Catherine and Thomas were seen as pillars of the community rather than objects of gossip. Catherine started a school for the ranch children, teaching them to read and write and do arithmetic in the barn on Sunday afternoons. Thomas became known as the man to call when someone needed help with a difficult birth or a sick animal or a neighbor in trouble. Together, they created something that felt like more than just survival, it felt like a life worth living. But the real measure of how far they'd come arrived on a Tuesday morning in May when a fancy carriage rolled up their drive carrying a woman Catherine hadn't seen in 5 years. "Hello, sister," Margaret said as she stepped down from the carriage, her Boston finery looking ridiculous in the Montana dust. "I've come to see if the rumors are true." Catherine stood on her porch, holding Sarah on her hip, wearing a simple cotton dress that she'd sewn herself and boots that were scuffed from honest work. She looked at her older sister, still perfectly dressed, still perfectly proper, still perfectly miserable, and felt nothing but pity. "What rumors would those be?" Catherine asked calmly. "That you've actually made something of yourself out here in this wilderness. That you're—" Margaret struggled with the words as if they tasted foreign in her mouth. "That you're happy." Catherine looked around at the life she'd built, the garden where vegetables grew in neat rows, the barn where her daughter would learn to ride, the husband who loved her for exactly who she was, the community that valued her contributions. the work that filled her days with purpose and satisfaction. "I am," she said simply. "I really am." Margaret stayed for 3 days, and Catherine watched her sister discover what it meant to live in a place where worth was measured by what you contributed rather than what you owned, where neighbors helped each other without expecting anything in return, where children played in the dirt and no one worried about their clothes getting stained. On the last morning, as Margaret prepared to leave, she pulled Catherine aside with tears in her eyes. "I always thought you made a terrible mistake when you left Boston," she said quietly. "I thought you'd thrown your life away for pride and stubbornness. But seeing you here, seeing what you've built, I think maybe I'm the one who made the mistake." "It's not too late," Catherine said gently. "You could start over too if you wanted to. You could choose something different." But Margaret just shook her head, climbing back into her carriage with a sad smile. "I'm not as brave as you are, Catherine. I never was." As the carriage disappeared down the road, Catherine felt a deep sense of peace settle over her like a warm blanket. She'd spent so many years trying to be the person other people wanted her to be that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to be herself. Now, standing in the morning sunshine with her daughter babbling happily in her arms and her husband whistling as he worked in the barn, she knew with absolute certainty that she'd found her place in the world. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains gold and purple, Sarah fell asleep in Catherine's lap and Thomas reached over to take her hand. "Any regrets?" he asked, the question he'd asked every year since their wedding. Catherine looked at the life spread out before them, messy and imperfect and more beautiful than anything she could have imagined when she'd stepped off that train in Millbrook Station with 17 cents and a broken heart. "Only one," she said, smiling as a shooting star streaked across the darkening sky. "I regret that it took me so long to learn that the only approval I needed was my own." The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of sage and wildflowers and the promise of tomorrow. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, but it wasn't a lonely sound anymore. It was the voice of the wild country calling to others of its kind, reminding them that home was wherever you chose to make it and family was whoever you chose to love. In the end, Catherine had learned that happiness wasn't something you found, it was something you built with your own hands, one day at a time, with courage enough to choose yourself and love enough to share that choice with others. And that was worth more than all the approval in the world.